Okay. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Stefano, for accepting our invitation. This is a webinar that is part of a cycle of webinars in political philosophy organized by California State University's Bay. Stefano Giacchetti received his PhD in philosophy with distinction from Loyola University Chicago, his MA from San Diego State University, and his laurea in sociology from Sapienza University of Rome. His area of research broadly addresses continental philosophy with a concentration in critical theory, in particular Theodor Adorno. He has recently published as editor and contributor the books Critical Theory and Challenge of Praxis, Routledge, and Nostalgia for a Redeemed Future, University of Delaware Press. His latest contribution is a chapter for the book Nietzsche and Critical Social Theory with Brill. He has taught and presented at many universities worldwide and served as Associate Academic Dean at Loyola's Rome Center. He was also a member of the Executive Committee of the Society for European Philosophy and is the founder and organizer of the annual International Critical Theory Conference of Rome. He's member of the editorial board of Dissonantia, Journal of Critical Theory, and of Berlin Journal of Critical Theory as co-founder. So thank you so much, Stefano, for being here today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Susie, for doing this. It's always a pleasure to work with you. I need to say that we used to work together back in the days, but we are both very young, so it was a bit obvious. And that for me, it's a particular honor to be here today because, as you mentioned before, I am, at least at the beginning of my philosophical studies, a product of California State, so university. So for me, it's a sort of like, even if you're all the way up north and I was in San Diego, it's still the same system. So I'm particularly happy about that.
Yeah.
The topic that I want to discuss today, I'm going to do some reading, especially because I have some important quotes. It's an enormously debated topic. Primarily, Adorno reads Marx, and I added to the title, defending, quoting Adorno, the quest for the right form of politics. Because, of course, the relationship between broadly critical theory, although when I say this, I am implying the first generation of critical theory, because, there's been many other generations, most noticeably the one of Habermas afterwards, the second generation, the third generation. Probably now we are at the fourth or fifth generation. But here I'm focusing on the first generation of critical theory, the one most noticeably carried out by Horkheimer as the director, Adorno, of course, a name that should be very familiar to Californians, namely Marcuse, who taught there for decades. But of course, in that gravitational area, we find Walter Benjamin and many, many others, key figures of the highest and most brilliant intellectuals of the 20th century. Uh, this is a debate, like I said, that it's been going on forever. I'd like to start by remembering the last time that I personally met with Tony Negri. Tony Negri is a very famous, was because he recently passed, very famous philosopher, especially in Italy, but especially in the US too, with the books like Empire and so on. And he came to present in Rome a few years ago, and we were talking, and he said, in a sarcastic way, but not so sarcastic. It was like, you followers of the negative dialectics is probably the most important work of Adorno. You followers of the negative dialectics, for me, do not even qualify as Marxists. And of course, this is a debate that has been going on forever because, I recall the famous image that was given by Georgi Lukács, who called these first generation of critical theorists, and especially Adorno, right, with the famous image of the Grand Hotel Abyss, right? He was talking about Schopenhauer in particular, but he was saying that among the major guests of the Schopenhauerian Grand Hotel Abyss, there were Horkheimer and Adorno too. This place of this ivory tower where these intellectuals were judging and criticizing society without ever getting their hands dirty, in a few words. I like even more, and it's a less known fact, the other figure that was called Tui, Tui, by Bertolt Brecht, who actually was never published, but he had the intentions of writing a novel about Tui, which literally means intellectual in, which was the figure, as Brecht puts it, a novel inspired by the figure of Adorno and the figure of the twisted intellectual prejudice against the practical solution of problems due to a purely highbrow attitude. So, during those years, these people knew each other, Lucas, Adorno, and Brecht, and actually they all ended up in Southern California during World War II, in particular Pasadena, of all the places. Side note, in the Pasadena library, public library, there are some documents that are really precious and that I worked on because at a certain point in time, especially during the mid 40s, Marcuse, Brecht, Adorno, many others, Thomas Mann, they were all there. So there was some sarcasm in these things, but ultimately it reveals definitely a sharp criticism of this first generation of critical theory as sort of incapable of fostering political activities. I'm not here to do an impossible task, namely to defend Adorno from these accusations, but to show that, especially through the reading of Adorno that he did of Marx in many of his works, something different comes out, something that is much more inclined into a less drastic reading of Adorno in particular. Um, as we know, or maybe I should discuss it more, the most important works of Adorno are certainly the negative dialectics, which, trust me, is an extremely complicated text. But even more complicated is the aesthetic theory for several reasons, primarily because the aesthetic theory was finished in 1969, and that's the year in which Adorno died. And we know that Adorno used to edit in a maniac way his works, and he was not able to do that because he died before that. So it's already an extremely complicated text, and it's a text that somehow, as Habermas puts it, bounces back and forth with the negative dialectics, one sending back to each other. What I would like to say here is that uh, it's true that the aesthetic theory is probably the most important work on aesthetics of 20th century, at least to my humble opinion. And it is true that the aesthetic theory doesn't approach any type of practical solution to the problems of capitalism, because that's what we was discussing. But it's unfair to take that text individually, and we'll discuss this briefly too. Um, there's something that I like to tell my students every time that I teach aesthetics, namely that, of course, there are huge differences between orthodox, if we can call it like that, Marxist aesthetics and Adorno's and critical theory aesthetics, because, of course, Marxism entrenched itself, especially through Lukács, in forms of realism, because realism is a language that can be understood by the masses and can lead towards a transformation of consciousness. As we know, instead, critical theory steered away from that and defended the most abstract forms of art. In particular, Adorno was a musician, and he defended the atonal composition of the Second School of Vienna, like Schoenberg, who was Alban Berg, a close friend. Adorno was also a musical composer, by the way. But I always tell my students, look, in our situation in contemporary capitalism, and I'll give more details of what is this tragic, dramatic situation, people, you often hear like, oh, can we really talk about revolution? Revolution is unethical, revolution is something that belongs to the past. But I tend to explain them that the problem is not whether or not a revolution should be envisioned. Of course, not in the terms that we tend to think about revolutions, such as the great revolutions of early 20th century, the Soviet, but even the later on, the Cuban or things like that. Revolution means a profound structural change of society. And dismissing the idea of revolution today in these simplified forms is not fair, because the horrors are the ones that are committed by capitalism and that are slapped in our face on a daily basis, whether we are brave enough to face these things or we hide our head under the rug. So the problem is not whether or not a revolution is ethical, especially in certain terms, because revolution doesn't imply rifles and assaults or things like that. Revolution could be structural in transforming the productive model, again, as I will discuss. But the real problem is who is capable today of doing this revolution? You know, at the times of Marx, there was a class consciousness among factory workers, for example, and that was immediately evident. I tell my students, if I had a time machine and I was going to take factory workers from the times of Marx into our discourse today, you will see that these people were absolutely illiterate. But they had a social and political awareness that today you dream of it, even with people with multiple PhDs. Because, of course, the class consciousness, as Marx calls it, was determined by objective factors which the workers were experiencing on a daily basis on their shoulder. Today is totally different. And this is the main difference that is addressed by critical theory. Who can do a revolution today? The middle class? The one that is struggling like vultures for the crumbs that are left by the capital? Or who's going to do that? Some people thought the so-called exploited people of the, I hate this terrifying expression, third world or emerging countries. No, these people are in absolute destitution and desperation. And again, you don't have to travel into some country that you cannot point out on the globe in Asia or in Africa. All you have to do is to go in the wrong exit on the L in Chicago and end up in the South Side, where you see people that wake up in the morning and they don't know if they're going to be alive at night. I'm sure that the same situation is around your places too. So the drastic problem that critical theory had to approach in comparison to the standard perspective of class consciousness, as explained by Marx, is this, that in the meantime, society transformed itself in a radical way, in the most drastic way, in terms of what we call ideology. Today, ideology infiltrates in all the little tiniest details of our existence. And that's why critical theory, especially in the year of exile in the US, they did most of their research, of course, back at the time on radio, and then eventually on television, and most noticeably on Hollywood movies, because this is how the propaganda machine of capitalism operates. And today, it's completely unprecedented. Today, we are talking about algorithms that determine your shopping habits based on a random conversation that you have, not even on social media, but even on your private phone. I keep saying, if I had this famous time machine, these poor factory workers from the times of Marx, you take him around for a walk and you will be shocked by the fact that we are bombed by commercials. Today, targeted commercials at every single aspect of our existence. So, ideology today is so part of our existence that, in fact, it became a sort of like the major field of study of critical theory, in what, of course, they were addressing primarily through media studies in what they called mass culture and the studies related to that. So in this situation, right, considering the aesthetic theory of Adorno as completely detached from reality and as a dimension of complete transcendence from the reified world of commodities, as the last shelter for creation of a utopian total otherness. Because art has this potential. Art has the potential of breaking us free from the dominant ideology. Of course, what art? I'm not talking about here of the latest hits on popular radio. These are commodities. Those have nothing artistic into it. I'm talking about what for Adorno is real art. The real art that, especially at this time, was blossoming in terms of abstract art, Kandinsky, Picasso, but in musical terms even more. And art has the unique potential of serving as a sort of like creating the antibodies against the dominant ideology. Again, real art. I don't want to go into the direction of explaining how today the word art and artist are completely abused and commodities are presented to us with these features, which is exactly the opposite. So it's particularly tragic. In Adorno, salvation is by no means either a merely aesthetical or theological category, but consists in the possibility of constructing an alternative to domination. In Adorno, going beyond domination means to envision models of practice that go against and beyond the instrumental and identifying reason. Adorno, in his negative dialectics, developed particularly the critique of identifying reason, a form of rationality that established itself back in the days. In this, Adorno is much more Nietzschean than not Marxist, in tracing back, like Nietzsche, the origin of instrumental reason, basically to the earliest form of social coexistence, which for Nietzsche coincides with the forms of market, right? Nietzsche says very explicitly in on the genealogy of morals, we started to think in terms of equivalencies because market were the early forms of social relations in an even more drastic form than Marx. I love that Adorno said, watch out, if you want the sharpest criticism of the bourgeoisie, look into Nietzsche, not Marx. And it's particularly true. Negative dialectics shows the same problem because in negative dialectics, it's called negative dialectics precisely because it's a form of dialectics inspired by Hegel, which doesn't find some type of ultimate resolution. It remains negative in the sense that it's a form of dialectics that is open, that never finds some type of fulfillment or positive outcome. The negative dialectic prevents as well the establishment of a fixed parameter or set of rules that would constitute a sort of a recipe for a free and emancipated society. Adorno remains open to redemptive praxis only insofar as it does not ground itself on a static paradigm. He refuses any philosophical system, and this is again a sort of a Nietzschean way of approaching philosophy, see philosophy and not theory. And claims that any phenomenon starting from an ultimate truth that is valid once and for all. This needs to be denied. The obstinacy of Adorno of avoiding any description of how we could achieve a free society can favor an interpretation of aesthetic theory as elitist, at the very least, and overall of his theory based on negative dialectics as irremediably separated from practice. That the Adorno theory is elitist, I cannot get into the details because it's an unfair accusation. Elitism is traced precisely by the Marxists because, in other words, who can go today into one of the urban ghettos in America, not to mention in the countries where material production is done, and play Schoenberg and say, hey, this is the way in which you can achieve freedom and autonomy. They shoot you, and rightly so. Other forms of more direct impact can have an effect that is actually much more important for social transformation. Adorno repeatedly affirms the interdependence of the categories of theory and praxis, especially in a book that is quite interesting that is called Critical Model. And I quote from Adorno, a consciousness of theory and praxis must be produced that does not divide the two such that theory becomes powerless and praxis becomes arbitrary. Adorno certainly cannot be accused of having fostered a position where praxis becomes arbitrary, but was he really able to prevent his theory from becoming powerless? His theory is definitely not powerless in terms of radical critique of alienation and reification. In terms of fostering critical consciousness that can lead us to the refusal of complicity in domination. Is this the convergence of theory and praxis that Adorno is calling for? For Adorno, critical thought is already a form of practice. And I quote from the critical model. Through its autonomization, theory becomes a transformative and practical productive force. So theory is already a form of praxis. Critical thinking is a radical form of praxis. But to what extent the reverse is true? Can the autonomization of practical productive forces from capitalistic modes of production transform consciousness? That this happens in art in Adorno is evident. It is precisely because an artwork is not under the spell of labor that it achieves its autonomy from ideology. But can this happen in work outside the sphere of artistic production? In Adorno's writings, we find several hints, and I would like to spell these hints, that this is possible, but is scarce, to say the least. Familiarity with the processes of material production prevented him from thoroughly developing this argument. His primary model remains artistic production. Now, we understand that the problem here, it's complicated, but simply to be explained. Consciousness transforms productive forces. But can productive forces transform consciousness? Because this second one would be the closest to Marx. We had consciousness from factory workers because their objective condition of labor were fostering an awareness of their situation of exploitation, something that today basically vanished. And here I love this quote of Adorno, which is extremely rare, but I always attach to this a lot of theoretical development. Is it possible in Adorno to envision a form of labor based, and I quote Adorno, oddly enough, from Minima Moralia, on free collaboration and solidarity with shared responsibility? Let's not hide behind the finger. He's talking about workplace democracy. So something that is Leninist in many ways. And in fact, Adorno, in his project of writing the second volume of The Dialectic of the Enlightenment, the famous book that he co-authored with Horkheimer, he claims we are Leninists. You know, again, coming from Adorno, it's quite shocking. This task of seeing whether or not there can be a form of labor with shared responsibility and based on collaboration and solidarity means that we have to see if we can adopt a Marxist conception of non-alienated labor in Adorno's theoretical framework. So, in order to do that, let's take a look more specifically of what Adorno has to say about Marx, although kind of briefly. According to Adorno, one of the greatest merits of Marx is that he did not create a philosophical system in a traditional sense. Marx dialectics, according to Adorno, is essentially open and negative, since it does not lead to a definitive conclusion, a la Hegel. And for Adorno, it is essential to interpret Marx in this sense in order to differentiate Marx from the so-called orthodox or dogmatic Marxism, and somehow also to shed some light to what seem to be inconsistencies in Marx theory. Marx praxis, as we know, has often been assimilated to this mediation of the Hegelian idea, right, which determines and suppresses the negative and leads to total rationality. We have to admit that some of the early writings of Marx seem to legitimate this interpretation. For example, in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscript of 1844, as we all well know, Marx states that communism is the riddle of history solved and knows itself as the solution. Yet Marxian praxis should not be considered as a suppression of the limit, the other. And here I like to quote Ernest Bloch, which Adorno would have fully subscribed to. And Bloch, I quote, what disappears in Marx is Hegel's interpretation of dialectics as a mere to and fro conversation in a cosmic discourse, so to speak, of a world architect with himself. Marx completely abandons this false mental subject in Hegel. But dialectics as an actual process, once the idealistic appearance falls away, becomes truly visible for the first time. It is the law of matter in motion, as dialectical, processual matter, which retains its openness. I'm not going to talk that much about the difference with Hegel and Marx because it becomes very sharp in books such as The Critique of Hegel's Dialectics and Philosophy in General. So it's very well spelled out by Marx. And in which Marx himself comes to the conclusion that, and I quote, the Hegelian dialectic presents nothing but the history of the production of abstract, that is, of absolute logical speculative thought. Marxian and Adornian dialectics seem then to coincide in the fact that not only they don't have an end, the absolute or the annulment of the otherness in the subject or the subject in the otherness, but they are dialectics based on what Adorno addressed as the primacy of the object, namely materialism, and non-identity. Their dialectical perspective would prevent the affirmation of either theory or praxis as self-sufficient, while also an immediate unity of theory and praxis, which suppresses their difference, would be undialectical. And here I quote a very strange passage from Adorno, in which he says, the dogma of the unity of theory and praxis, contrary to the doctrine on which it is based, is undialectical. The relationship between theory and practice, after both have once distanced themselves from each other, is that of qualitative reversal, not transition, and surely not subordination. They stand in a polar relationship. And this is the important passage. Marx's resistance concerning theoretical recipe for praxis was hardly less than that concerning a positive description of a classless society. Capital contains numerous invectives, most often against economists and philosophy, but no program for action. Marx by no means surrendered himself to praxis. And that is true because, again, in the history of Marx, people attach themselves to a couple of pages of the Communist Manifesto, which was written for a precise historical period with precise social conditions, but I dare you to find me in the capital recipes of political praxis in Marx. For Adorno, the peculiarity of Marx materialism lies in its authentic dialectical nature, and in fact, it does not propose itself as a system. Dialectical materialism has the function of raising the physiological basis of life, expressed through passion and needs, to the center of philosophical analysis, but contrary to the other forms of materialism, it does not claim the absolute exhaustiveness of a theoretical system. Marx's materialism, in fact, is that form of praxis which leads to the suppression of materialism itself. I promise this is one of the last quotes that I have, but it's really important. And I quote from Adorno. This is from philosophic terminology, and it's my translation because it's not been translated in English. Marxian materialism as a goal which differentiates it from the other materialistic philosophies. If material conditions of humanity will be completely fulfilled, that is, if the reproduction of the human species and the satisfaction of human needs will be finally freed from exchange value, from the theme of a profit, humanity would then cease to live under the yoke of matter. The complete fulfillment of materialism will be at the same time also its end. This, again, for Adorno is quite important because it shows that in Marx you cannot claim a system, and least of all, a science, the Diamat, the Soviet scientific Marxism. Only an approach of the works of Marx that realizes how his thought rejects any definitive and absolute conclusiveness is capable of giving an account of the apparent incoherencies in some crucial conception of Marx. Most of these incoherences are related to Marx's fundamental distinction between structure and superstructure. This distinction in Marx means to consider the notion of structure strictly as a historical category, rather than a true essence. Here, rather than reading, I would like to explain this distinction between structure and superstructure. Because you see, in Marx, structure is the economic process through which labor is carried out in a determined society, as we know. So, of course, in his historical reconstruction, he talks about different forms of structure, chronologically speaking, from the tribal to the ancient to the feudal. And then out of that, with the clashing of the polar social classes, a new society comes out with two new opposite social classes that, again, will determine new tensions. Primarily is interested, of course, in capitalism, which came out of the feudal system, and in which the structure is defined by the system of production of capitalism. Well, Adorno follows a very different path. Adorno goes all the way back in his analysis of domination in rationality. And in fact, in the dialectic of the Enlightenment, he finds out that the bourgeoisie is not a capitalist class. The bourgeoisie can be found all the way back to Odysseus, all the way back into ancient Greece, because, of course, it's the formation of the individual, self-sufficient, we would say self-made man, capable of achieving financial success at the cost of the most violent repression, as the episode of the sirens clearly explains. So, the alienation of labor is the cause of the falsity of our social totality, but in Adorno, this is not a problem specific to capitalism. This is a problem that is ingrained in our form of instrumental reason. Again, dialectic of the Enlightenment would be the best place to find this idea. I'm going to try to be short. Of course, being short is not very easy, but here, what Adorno's reading of Marx aims at is that the social totality, which in Hegel represents the truth, in Marx is its falsity. The structure of our society is based on a lie. The lie of our society are the ones that present the world as democratic, free, and all the stuff that we know, while ultimately they only care about accumulation of profit and crushing workers and human beings as mere tools of production. So Adorno substituted the notion of structure that was developed by Marx in reference to capitalism with the general notion of domination of nature. Domination of nature includes capitalism, but it extends beyond this historical formation in modernity, as I discussed now. Following Adorno reconstruction, the proletariat is basically in no different situation than all the other exploited classes in history. The alienation of labor does not put them in a privileged position in terms of critical consciousness. For Adorno, critical consciousness is achieved through a radical redefinition of subjectivity, which has affirmed the principle of identity as the sole parameter for rationality. It is necessary to restore the telos to the rationality of domination, which has been reduced to a mere calculation of the means. According to Adorno, Marx's proposal of the proletariat as the class that can bring forth a revolutionary change of society is based on an explicit deterministic principle. The contradiction of society will be solved by internal movement of history. And again, many quotes of Marx can support that. But Adorno insists on the fact that the truth of the present in Marx is its falsity, not a positive structure. I think that Adorno did a good job in showing that Marx was somehow able to free himself from the determinism of Hegelian dialectics, although again with some relapses, especially in the young Marx. But what is important here is that the rationality which sets the pacification of nature as its objective operates in the opposite manner of a merely instrumental reason. It finally has its social goal towards which it can orientate its means. On an individual level, a liberating praxis following this interpretation of Adorno Marx has the characteristic of what Adorno defines resistance, a form of behavior which embodies full autonomous thought. On a social scale, as Adorno observed, and I quote from Adorno, the Archimedean point, how might a non-repressive praxis be possible, is how one might steer between the alternative of spontaneity and organization. Adorno, here to me, seems more Nietzschean than Marxist. He rejects the political organizations because it's very different of the ideological role that is played on the masses. And he explicitly, and I'm not going to quote it because it's fairly long, but he explicitly is more in favor of political praxis that is based on spontaneity. Why? Because social movements, the radical, real social movements originate from material needs. People are desperate, people are unemployed, people are in search for a better life. And this is substantially different than all the ideological games played in political movements. And also because he was completely discouraged both by the Soviet model of politics, which turned out to be totalitarian, and even more totalitarian are the so-called democracies in Western societies, in which you basically have to choose between two alternative candidates, which have differences, but ultimately none of them is ever going to affect the structure, the mode of production of a certain country. I'm going to skip a little bit for time here regarding how praxis can be rejected in imperialistic forms of government. I find more important to say that capitalism is now the feature of an administered world that represses the formation of a critical consciousness. That's the key problem. The analysis of the administered world is a prerequisite for the change of perspective on how to achieve its suppression. The greatest obstacle to non-dominative praxis of resistance is the increasingly powerful coercion towards standardization created by social forms of control, whether this coercion is explicitly carried out on violent repression of any antagonistic movement, think about the Black Panthers, or subliminally perpetrated through ideological and apologetic mass culture. This is why Adorno's sociological analysis is primarily focused on authoritarian forms of social control and on the element of standardization in mass culture. What completely contemporary capitalism has accomplished is a fake horizontal distribution of wealth, where each single petty bourgeois can feel his participation in the economic system through the insignificant share of stocks to which his future is relegated. This social class is bound up in the illusion of actually possessing a part of capital, while monopolism is spreading under the camouflage of the speed through which the new economy can move. As we know, the concentration of monopolistic groups, but by now even individual, is larger than many countries combined. The proletarian class in Western society has been absorbed into the strictest dependence of the rules of the markets, while those who still work in a factory cannot even determine who will be the owner of the enterprise the following day. All those who still have not been able to or who purposely refuse to adhere to this productive mechanism live under the permanent threat of unemployment and be reabsorbed at any time into absolute destitution. The new slaves of contemporary capitalism have become invisible. All the horrors that are striking the so-called third world are just ignored, or in the best scenario, seen as natural consequences of overpopulation. The fragmentation and the repeatability characteristic of Tayloristic organization of works have determined the loss of global outlook on the production process, making the absence of preparation and politicization completely functional to this system. This is extremely relevant for what we are living now. The consequences of this process immediately involve the cultural sphere, reducing even traditional critical areas to functional parts of the production system. The Adorno's concept of totality has presently reached such a stage of maturity and perfection that all its rules have become so strict and perfectly functional to it that even the smallest opportunity to escape from this cage has become a threat which must be immediately repressed. Any reference to present political systems is absolutely wanted. In the centralization of the state bureaucratic power, you cannot find an alternative in traditional Marxist model. Since I think I need to be short, because otherwise I have another good 40 minutes.
Yeah, no, we need to give space
right?
to the question.
I want to say that a form of production that is founded on solidarity and cooperation, as I earlier quoted Adorno, is certainly in line with the development of rationality of pacification of nature, insofar as it is capable of sustaining the welfare of society as the whole rather than the restricted interest of particular sector of it. And in conclusion, what this analysis is trying to achieve is not an impossible interpretation of Adorno's theory as proposing a full disclosure of positive images of praxis, but to develop his own interpretation of Marx into an active subversion of the false totality. In the first place, this means to go beyond the interpretation of Marx in terms of historical determinism and to reaffirm his critique of ideology and alienation as the key for a conception of humanity as autonomous and free. Our hope for a life that finally lives, quoting Adorno, in the Unwesen of our social totality lies today in our reasonable ability to resist the globalization of domination. Going back to Marx's 11 theses on Feuerbach, what we wanted to show here is that the critique of rationality sustained by Adorno is not a mere interpretation of the world. This critique, in fact, is fundamental prerequisite towards the affirmation of radical alternative to the catastrophic consequences of capitalism. The point, though, is still to change the world. This change will not occur through a merely aesthetic critique of the false totality. The aesthetic model needs to become practical. Adorno philosophy needs to be brought back to the original Marxist task of changing the economic structure of society. Adorno's critique is an invaluable tool for raising consciousness against the administered world, but it leaves completely open the question concerning how to change this world. His fear that any positive image of political practice would immediately transform itself into a restraint for autonomous quest for the right form of politics shows its limits, which can be summarized in Martin Jay's observation that Adorno's politics is clearly more a politics of attitude than not of programmatic or procedural standard. Forcing an interpretation of Adorno's political theories would be counterproductive. At best, it would propose an individual resistance to heteronomy. The value of the tradition of critique of rationality we analyze here is in its ability to provide the Marxist task of a structural change of society with a critical insight on the causes that prevented its fulfillment. The Grand Hotel Abyss is on a perfect location for seeing the causes of the unfulfilled dream of a free society. The acknowledgement that we are blindly proceeding towards catastrophe, the refusal of a blind optimism in a rationality grounded in domination, is necessary for stepping out of the vicious circle of productivity in capitalism, the circularity of production, consumption, and death. Critique of rationality, though, must become practical. The prospects that Adorno offers for a change of our model of rationality are decisive for counteracting the domination implied in a merely instrumental reason.
Thank you, Stefano.
Thank
Thanks for
you.
this
Thank you.
thoughtful presentation. Now I invite you both here on Zoom and on YouTube to ask questions. We have 10 minutes more or less. So please don't be shy. I'm pretty sure that this presentation elicits multiple questions. Thank you for giving a name to all this.
I wonder if there are any thoughts, especially concerning other different perspectives that usually are considered more standard in terms of Marx. It's not easy. Like I said, Tony Negri would never accept a reading of Marx like this, someone like Tony Negri, especially a more scientific interpretation of Marxism. It's quite different.
I mean, I found fascinating the way in which Adorno needs, the comings back to Nietzsche. I didn't expect to find this in Nietzsche. About the interpretations of Marx, I've been overwhelmed by, the ways in which he can be read. I never expected to find this in Nietzsche.
Nietzsche's criticism of the bourgeoisie, of course, is more in line with Adorno, because as for Adorno, the bourgeoisie is not something, again, a la Marx, that develops in precise economic structure of production. But in Nietzsche, the genealogical method shows that it's a problem of rationality. And so much so that Nietzsche calls it poetic rationality as an alternative of the rationality of domination. But there is a question.
Yes, so Huang, and also Jennifer has a question.
Oh, yeah.
Oh God, we have to get to Jennifer's question also. Yeah, Wang.
Well, first, or should I wait for? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, the connection maybe breaks a little.
Oh, so I was wondering for the Adorno's critique of aesthetic as like the sort of maybe a sanctioned place, as you call it, from what I feel like Adorno's in especially his music, his ethereal music, is that it's sort of this paradise that escape it's the non-identity that escape the universalization. Would you say that? And then so that just make me think of Badiou's conception of an event and he also mentioned, I think it's not a coincidence that art is this sort of truth event that opens up the rupture of the reality. How do you think that their philosophical project differs in this kind of way, that Badiou perhaps wants a more active, more engaging picture, engage with the reality, keep your fidelity to the event and so on, while Adorno sort of retreats from the in the scary universalization of capitalism?
This is an excellent question. I wonder, because the answer concerning Adorno, to me, seems to trace back to Ernest Bloch, who Adorno loved so much, especially in the early production, the more expressionist production, if you want, the more artistic production, such as The Spirit of Utopia. And I wonder if Badiou got into reading Spirit of Utopia as well, which I'm fairly sure he did. Because I think that in both cases, the point is this primarily. Art represents the reawakening of something that has been completely shattered by capitalism, the possibility of envisioning something completely different, completely different. Sometimes I give to my students a stupid example, like, have you ever bought a lottery ticket? You know that you are way better chances of being hit 22 times in a row by an asteroid than not winning the lottery. And yet you buy it. Why? Because, of course, in a distorted, commodified way, for a few minutes, you start to think, what if? What if? Of course, in most of the cases, in a commodified way, but in some cases, even in more existential ways. This is sort of like, I tell my students, listening or experiencing in general great art, art that deserves to be called such, it's a little bit like buying a lottery ticket. Adorno insists on the fact that art it's a promise of happiness, will never bring you happiness. But it can promise you happiness because it makes you transcend a reality which capitalism forces you violently to adhere to, in the most vulgar manner that you can imagine, especially today with mass media. So I think that both Adorno and Badiou would agree with this opinion of Marx, that the event that occurs in the aesthetic experience, it's a moment of rapture. It's a moment of realization of what truly matters in your life, right? It's a way of, you know, allow me to be trivial. You listen to Doja Cat, right? And the best thing that you get is some type of cheap pornography. You cannot call it anything else. Artistically speaking, is completely irrelevant. And then you listen to Beethoven, or you read Shakespeare. They both talk about love. But one is the commodified version of love, which is exactly what society wants you to adhere to. If instead you read Shakespeare, Shakespeare is never going to tell you what love is. He's going to inspire you to go like, what if? What if for once in my life I could experience something so personal, unique, private, that is again the opposite of the commodified version. And in this is a transformative event. This is why I keep repeating this. If you were capable of truly enjoying Alban Berg opera Lulu, it's not like then after that you go back in front of Fox News and you go like, this makes sense. You're immune. You're immune. You're immune to all the commodified structure of society. So it is a radically transformative event, that's for sure.
Thank you for the beautiful question and answer. And here there's Jennifer's question. I know that in 5 minutes she needs to go. What would Adorno say about the Trump's administration? Not that the folks on the left say all candidates are the same and don't change the system, but look where we are in the US. So
I'd rather not. But no, look, this is something that, of course, I discuss in my courses, in my seminars. Actually, it turns out that I talk about it more in the seminars that I hold in psychiatry departments than in philosophy settings. Because, look, there is a mistake, according to me, and it's an Adornian reading. Trump is not the problem. Trump is the effect. Trump does not generate the problem. Trump is one of the effects, probably one of the most vulgar effects of this absolute monopolism that flies over the moon. Uh, what would Adorno think of Trump? What would Adorno think? A recent study, of course, very approximate, and didn't even contemplate the latest because here you need to update it by the minute. Did a study saying if we were to put the profits in a year of people like Bezos, Musk, and so on, you know how much they would make an hour? It's about 30 million an hour. So do you think that the problem is Trump or the problem is capitalism that by now has become so savage that especially in the US, again, you have what I called in my paper the vultures. For me, Trump is a vulture, a bigger vulture, but a vulture that is there to, instead of taking the crumbs as us, all of us do, he's taking millions. But again, it's nothing in comparison. So, unfortunately, the history of American president is usually a history of puppets, starting from Reagan, right? That are there because, of course, they can put a face that is more appealing to the masses and because they don't get their hands directly dirty. But Adorno would consider Trump, um, I'm trying not to say the word, but the F word comes out. The fascist prototype of authoritarianism that is led by capitalism. Fascism was created by capitalism. No more no less like today, the regurgitations of fascism are the same way created by the oligarchies of capitalism. It's a history that is tragically repeating itself. I'm sorry, I should have been more polite, politically correct, right? But
well, the question called for this answer, not at all. She says, there's a new question from Josh. Forgive my potential misunderstanding. Is the assertion that the domination that is currently manifest in capitalism goes back to ancient Greece indicative that it is human nature, the nature of political structures, or simply a matter of the continuance of a method that is effective for control? A sort of momentum that by virtue of its energy continues. If it is so old and repeatedly manifests differently and currently in such an insidious form, can you imagine as it is being eliminated from societies?
this is a fundamental question. In Adorno, you don't have the problem of misunderstanding it as part of human nature. He rejects it completely. And he shows, like Nietzsche, a genealogy of these proto-bourgeois back in ancient Greece. So it's not like something that is ingrained in some type of genetic distortion that we have, neither in Adorno, and I would add, nor in Nietzsche. It is the consequence of a way in which a certain type of rationality has affirmed itself in Western tradition. That by today, with globalization, means everywhere. But back in the days, they were looking, both Nietzsche and Adorno, for a genealogical search of what is that?
I really like this book. It's not so popular, but it really explains well the construction of rationality in the US, constructing the self-constructing America.
Yeah, no, but rationality doesn't have anything to do with genetic predisposition. Or rationality has developed like this because it's more efficient. And that's why today, through globalization, Western rationality is the dominant one. But what you pay in terms of the efficiency of this calculative rationality is the fact that you are dehumanized. And not only that, the fact that you are repressed, because one of the sharpest critique of this type of rationality, you find it in probably one of the best readers of Nietzsche, Freud. Freud, Civilization and its Discontent. So I would refuse completely the idea that it's ingrained in us. So much so that different forms of rationality prove themselves to be very practical, very practical. And again, in Adorno, ultimately, it's a very complicated problem, but it ultimately means to substitute the end of rationality. Rationality is defined as the calculation of the means towards an end. The problem is that today we have become extremely specialized in calculating the means, which means technology. But we forgot the end. The end was supposed to be human happiness. Nobody's happy. We only focus on the means, on the calculation of the means. And in calculating, we look at technology skyrocketed. But we forgot that there was an end for that. And it was post-social, communal happiness, because individual happiness doesn't exist. Happiness all by yourself. I see that there's another question, but I don't know how you see that. Oh, through the chat.
This must be the last question, and it's really painful for me that I have to go because this is so good. But yes, this question. Is it possible to find the instrumental rationality in favor of a poetic or artistic rationality? How? Isn't AI going to complicate it?
Oh my God, I was already depressed to talk about these things. But if we start to talk about AI, oh my God, it's probably the real monster coming out. The dream of reason produced monster. This is the dream of plagiarism creates the bigger monster. So AI definitely complicates enormously things because AI is the instrumental side of instrumental reason. So it's squared instrumental reason. So it's absolutely frightening. I don't know to what extent will this go on. After all, I tend to console myself because I'm old enough to remember the birth of internet. And internet seemed to be like, this terrible machinery that was going to crash us all. Artificial intelligence, if like technology, were to be controlled democratically by the people, it would be an invaluable tool for human growth. The problem is that it's in the end of companies that only care about profit. So it's the same scheme. But even more important is your first question for me, right? In front of the instrumental reason, in favor of poetic or artistic rationality. It's not necessarily poetic or artistic, but it's a form of reason that, again, resonates a lot in Nietzsche. Nietzsche resonates in Adorno a lot. It's a form of rationality that recognizes what Western rationality cannot deal with: passions, emotions, feelings. How much do you love me on a scale 1 to 10? It's moronic. It's idiotic, right? Trying to calculate and reduce to numbers things that resist in its strongest form precisely this reduction to calculation: passions, emotions, and feelings. So we live like schizophrenic people. On one hand, we have this extremely calculative rationality, and on the other hand, there is our body that once in a while raises finger. You know what? At least I'm gonna give you colitis. At least I'm gonna remind you that I'm still there. I'm gonna present myself with impulses, with passions. But then again, Freud was absolutely right. Right? We live in a form of pathological society in which we forgot that there is something irrational about our existence that should be as valuable as the rational one. I hate irrationalist philosophy. None of them, even Schopenhauer is an irrationalist. Nobody wants to give up rationality, but it needs to be in a Nietzschean way, counterbalance. Nietzsche was calling it the balancing of Dionysus and Apollo. Apollo, the geometric calculative rationality. Dionysus, the god of estrangement, the god of when passions emerge and they make you scream, they make you loud, they make you cramp, right? So it's more of recreating that balance also on an individual level, not to be crashed into becoming automata, computers, calculating machines devoid of any humanity. But again,
Thank you, Stefano.
it's very complicated and depressing.
I have the feeling that, yeah, we should give you a podcast. I have the feeling that this can continue and continue. I mean, it's, yeah,
Okay.
I'm very grateful that we had this hour to discuss together.
I am the one who has to thank you. I am the one who has to thank you because I think that the work that you're doing is fundamental. And the only problem is that you might have somebody knocking at your door fairly soon and say, let's go for a ride.
Strange times, but it's beautiful
Strange.
that students come and we had a space to discuss. Yeah, if you want, Joshua, I can connect. If for Stefan is okay, I can
Absolutely.
connect the two of you because yeah, there's space and space for conversations on this.
Absolutely. I would love that.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you,
Ciao,
Susie. I
Stefano.
hope don't be a stranger.
No, never. Ciao, un abbraccio.
Thanks, everyone.